So let's take a look at the first passage of chapter 5. As usual, read it over and decide whether or not this contains an argument. So pause the video, think for a bit, and come back when you're ready. Okay, I think this does contain an argument, but there's a very good reason why that might be hard to see. I would like you to take a moment again and see if you can identify the ultimate conclusion. Now, this might be hard and you might not be able to do it. And if you cannot do it, that's okay. But let's just try. I would recommend read it over a couple of times and then actually look away from the screen. Don't even look at the passage and ask yourself, what is this passage trying to convince me of? What does the author want me to believe? Write that down. Just on a sheet of paper, write down what you think the author of this passage wants you to believe. Just do your best, okay? So take a minute, pause the video, do that, and come back when you've done it or have given up. Okay, so let's take a look. As I said, this can be hard to identify the ultimate conclusion here. And we go back to our procedure. I actually say, if you aren't sure what the conclusion is, just go on to step 2, because sometimes you might not know. So let's just pretend we don't know here. Even if you think you figured it out, that's great, but let's just pretend we don't know what it is and see if we can map it anyway. So let's start by reading and seeing what we think is important here. We've spent some time exploring philosophy, looking at the fields of epistemology, value theory, and metaphysics. In the course of our examination, we've seen that philosophy can't answer any of its questions because philosophers often disagree about almost everything. Obviously, if the subject can't even answer some questions, it's of no help to society as a whole, more or less. So what about the first sentence here? We've spent some time exploring philosophy, looking at the fields of epistemology, metaphysics, and value theory. Is that going to be important? Now, it can be hard to answer that question if we don't know what the ultimate conclusion is, because normally we settle that issue by asking, does this claim help to establish the ultimate conclusion? If we don't know what the ultimate conclusion is, it's hard to answer that question, but we can kind of just suss it out. It doesn't feel like it's an important part of the argument to me. So let's not include that. Let's go on. In the course of our examination, we've seen that philosophy can't answer any of its questions because philosophers disagree about almost everything. What about that? Is that an important claim? Or are there more than one important claims? Just ask yourself, is anything in here important? And how many things in there are important? That's all. So think about that for a moment. Pause the video, come back when you're ready. Okay. There's stuff that's important in here, right? Even if I don't know what the ultimate conclusion is, I'm seeing that because. So that tells me that there are 2 claims. One of them is, in the course of our examination, we've seen that philosophy can't answer any of its questions. Really what's important here is just philosophy can't answer any of its questions. So that's what I'm going to identify as a claim. And also philosophers disagree about almost everything. Now, should I have this be number 1? Or not? It really doesn't matter. Generally speaking, I try to reserve the number 1 for an ultimate conclusion that I identify. So since I'm not sure if this is the ultimate conclusion, I'm going to give it 2. That's just my bookkeeping mechanism. My bookkeeping mechanism, not a big deal. And then this would be 3. So we have 2 claims. We don't want to think about more than 2 things at a time. So resist the temptation, resist the urge to read on. Identify the relationship between 2 and 3 and map that. How are they related? Inferentially with an arrow, added with a plus, or separate with convergent arrows. Pause the video, map that, and then come back when you're ready. Okay, so what do you think? Philosophy can't answer any of its questions because philosophers disagree about almost everything. So let's see. I see that because that is going to be an inference indicator expression. It's a reason indicator expression. So it says that 3 is a reason to believe 2. So I'm going to put 3 on top of 2 and connect them with an arrow, right? like that. Perfect. Now, let's continue to read. Obviously, a subject that can't even answer its own questions is of no help to society as a whole. So do you think that's going to be important? I think so. So we're going to give this number 4. And now we ask, how is 4 related to this 3 arrow 2 bit? So think about that. Is 4 going to be related to this thing with an arrow, with a plus, or with separate arrows? So pause the video, think about that, and come back when you're ready. Okay, let's imagine arrows. Let's imagine that 4 is down here. So if 4 is underneath the 2, maybe we think it's this. That would mean that 2 is a reason to believe 4. Let's check that. If someone did not believe that a subject that can't answer its own questions is of no help to society as a whole, could we convince them of it by saying, well, philosophy can't answer any of its questions? I don't think so. So I don't think that 4 comes from or is supported by 2. What about maybe on top of 3? Might 4 be a reason to believe 3? Could I say philosophers disagree about almost everything because a subject that can't even answer its own questions is of no help to society as a whole? I don't think so. So no. So if 4 does not come from 2, is not supported by 2, and if 4 does not support 3, I don't think that 4 is connected to this 2-3 bit within inference. What about added? Would 4 be added to 3 or 2? Well, maybe it would be added to 3. In fact, that's not a bad guess because after all, 4 and 3 are right next to each other in the passage. And a rule of thumb, it's a fallible rule of thumb, but it's good to have in the back of your head, is that if 2 claims are next to each other in the passage, they might be next to each other in the map. So let's try this. Philosophers disagree about almost everything. A subject that can't even answer its own questions is of no help to society as a whole. Well, the first thing that I notice is that 3 and 4 don't really have any common concepts. They don't hook up anywhere naturally. Also, it looks to me like 2 does not need the help, the 3 rather, does not need the help of 4 to give us 2. Philosophers disagree about almost everything. And a subject that can't even answer its own questions is of no help to society as a whole. Therefore, philosophy can't answer any of its own questions. I don't think that 4 really helps 3. So no, I don't think that 4 will be added to 3. What about added to 2? Let's try that. Philosophy can't answer any of its questions. A subject that can't even answer its own questions is of no help to society as a whole. Well, now there we have it. 2 and 4 do have stuff in common, right? They do have that kind of common concept that allows them to hook up. So we have identified how 4 is related to this thing. It's related to that thing, the 2-3 thing with the plus. They're dependent reasons. Our new step is, if the claims are related as dependent reasons, we want to ask ourselves what follows from them, and we want to add that. Okay? So ask yourself, what follows from 2 and 4? If someone believes 2 and someone believes 4, what might they be inclined to conclude from that? What would follow from that, right? So think about that, write it down. When you're finished, come back. Okay, what do you have? Well, let's see here. I want to, philosophy can't answer any of its questions. A subject that can't even answer its own questions is of no help to society as a whole. So what they both have in common, 2 and 4, is this not being able to answer its own questions, correct? What's left over? Philosophy is of no help to society as a whole. That must be what follows. So let's have that be the conclusion that follows from 2 and 4. And actually, I'm going to represent it like this. 2 plus 4 gives us, now I'm going to give claims that follow from other claims but aren't stated in the passage. In other words, missing conclusions. I'm going to give them little letters. So this is going to be, if you hear that scratch, 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 by the way, that's my dog Buster. He's around here. So I'm sorry if this, I'm going to listen to this, and if it seems like that's distracting, I'll redo it. I'm hoping it's not distracting. Philosophy can't answer any of its questions. A subject that can't answer any of its questions is of no help to society as a whole. What do they have in common? Can't answer any of its questions. The idea that follows from them is composed of the leftover notions, and that would be philosophy is of no help to society as a whole. That's what follows from 2 and 4, and that is the unstated ultimate conclusion, and we've identified it. This is our very first unstated conclusion. Sometimes people do not state the ultimate conclusion. There could be a couple of reasons for that. One might be they just think it's obvious given what was stated before, and if you go out of your way to state the obvious, it can be insulting to your reader who thinks, well, come on, of course I can figure that out, right? Also, sometimes people don't state their ultimate conclusions because they think it might be shocking or offensive, and so they can't bring themselves to actually say it. They can go right up to it, and they know what the conclusion is, and you know what the conclusion is, and they know that you know what the conclusion is, and they know that you know that they know what the conclusion is, right? That kind of a game. But there it is. So the ultimate conclusion here is philosophy is of no help to society as a whole, and it stems from all of that. And if way back at the beginning of this passage, when I asked you to write down what the ultimate conclusion is, if you found that right away, huzzah, very good. And by the way, when there is a missing ultimate conclusion that I identify right away, I am going to give that letter A instead of number 1. And then I'm going to start numbering the claims in the passage at 2. That's just my convention, nothing magic about it. So congratulations, we did our very first passage with a missing conclusion, and I'll catch you in passage 4. Passage 2.